Good afternoon. On behalf of Superintendent Joy Hoffmeister and the Oklahoma State Department of Education, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on English Learner Identification and the English Language Academic Plan, or ELAP. My name is Tom Kirk, and I am in the Office of Federal Programs. If you were with us earlier in the day, we did an overview of the Title III program. There's some overlap with the material we'll cover this afternoon, but I hope we'll be able to go into a little bit more detail than we could in that other webinar. So what I want to talk about is the English learner identification process in general, and we will look within that process at the home language survey. I also want to mention bilingual status, even though that's not really linked to federal programs. It is linked to the home language survey, so we'll mention that. I'd like to say a word about identifying English learners in a distance learning setting, and then go over some common causes of confusion surrounding mainly the home language survey, and then go into more detail than we did earlier on the ELAP, the English Language Academic Plan, and completing that form. So with that, we'll just dive in here. The identification of English learners. LEAs, these local education agencies, school districts, are required to identify English learners in a timely and reliable manner. So that means identification should take place within 30 days of enrollment, if at the beginning of the school year, or within 2 weeks of enrollment during the school year. And that's 30 calendar days, not 30 school days. So here at the beginning of the year, the entire process should take place within a month, more or less. Once the year gets rolling, you should be able to complete the process within a couple of weeks. That process begins with the home language survey, or the HLS. You'll often see it abbreviated HLS. The home language survey assists in fulfilling the federal requirement under ESSA to identify potential English learners. And some general rules regarding the home language survey here in Oklahoma. The form was overhauled fairly recently. So a survey completed in the 2016-2017 school year or later can follow a student as long as that student remains in the district where the survey was completed. So it's not necessary to give a new home language survey every year, although a lot of districts do that just because it's easier than keeping track of who's done it and who hasn't. But you can, have a single home language survey for a student as long as it was done since the 2016-17 school year. Students are required to complete a new survey if they move to a new district or if they return to a district after an absence of more than a year. So in those cases, you would have to do a new home language survey. Completed surveys then are to be stored in the student's cumulative folder, or if you store your records electronically, they have to be accessible in a digital format, and you have to have a completed home language survey on file or accessible in a digital format for every student. Okay, so that clearly will anticipate another question. It is okay to have an electronic home language survey as long as it has all of the questions or all of the information on it that you find on the one developed by the State Department of Education. The home language survey in itself does not determine English learner status, but what it does do is indicate which students are to be given the WIDA screener assessment. So it's the first step in the process. And if you do not have a home language survey, the form developed by the State Department of Education is available in both English and Spanish on the OSD website. It's on under the Title III tab of the federal programs website. Anyhow, here's a link here in the slide. And I will go ahead and say, we're recording this. This will go up on the federal programs website within a couple of days. It usually takes a day or two for that to happen, but it will be up fairly soon. So the home language survey itself looks like this image here on the left side of your screen. That's a screenshot, and it's not really clear enough to read very well. So I've typed out the first 3 of 6 questions there. The 3 language questions, this is what we're interested in. The first one, what is the dominant language most often spoken by the student? 2, what is the language routinely spoken in the home, regardless of the language spoken by the student? And 3, what language was first learned by the student? And these are the first 3 of the 6 questions there on the top half of the home language survey. If a student answers a language other than English to any of these questions, then that student should be screened for potential EL status. They should be given the WIDA screener test to see if they are to be identified as an English learner. Bilingual status, which is a status that affects state funding, is also, or can be, determined by the home language survey. Home language survey is, again, the first step in determining bilingual status. So the responses here, both flag students for EL screening, but can determine bilingual status. There is a packet called the Bilingual Count Verification Packet that outlines general rules concerning basic identification. This has a very useful flow chart in it also for establishing coding for the WAVE, and that's available on the State Department of Education website. I have the link here too. That will take you to the Title III tab of the federal programs website, where this verification packet is available. You may notice this is the 2020-2021 bilingual count verification packet. Nothing has changed in terms of the content of this packet over last year. So it's some of the graphics have been updated, but basically it's the same packet if you're familiar with last year's one. Then another thing to remember, all EL students are considered bilingual, but not all bilingual students are necessarily EL. So, okay, remember our 3 questions from the home language survey. If an EL, or if a student puts a language other than English on any of those, then they're flagged for screening and can be identified as EL. If a student answers 2 or more of those questions with a language other than English, then that student is called more often and automatically qualifies as bilingual for your accreditation report. If the student answers a language other than English on only one of those questions, then this student is considered less often and might qualify for bilingual funding. So they qualify for bilingual funding if they meet one of these 3 criteria, which are a score on the WIDA assessment, qualifying them as an English learner. So all of your English learners are going to fall into this category, both English learners and bilingual. If a student has a language other than English on one of the questions and a score of basic or below basic on the previous year's OSTP ELA assessment, then they would qualify as bilingual. Or if the student is less often, that is, they have a language other than English on one of those questions and a score at or below the 35th percentile composite reading score from the spring of the previous school year on a state-approved norm reference test, then they would count as bilingual. So these are the criteria for establishing bilingual status. You have to keep appropriate documentation on this identification. Districts failing to provide appropriate documentation for bilingual funding may be required to reimburse previously distributed funds. Okay, identifying English learners in a distance learning setting. This is a timely topic, I think of interest to a lot of people this year. If a district is unable to screen and identify potential English learning students in person, it should do so. So if you can screen them in person, please do. Potential English learning students who are not available for screening may be formally identified using the WIDA remote screener. That would be using all bands for K-1, low and mid bands for 2 to 12. Any student provisionally identified through the distance identification process released by OSDE last spring of 2020, should be reassessed with the traditional or remote screener at the outset of the 2020-2021 school year. So if you used the provisional process that was released very shortly after schools were closed last spring, then you should reassess those students either with the normal screener or the remote screener now, basically, here at the beginning of the school year. Further to that, any student given the WIDA remote screener should be reassessed with the traditional screener as soon as you return to a normal classroom setting. And the WIDA remote screener must be administered in accordance with the WIDA developed guidelines and procedures, with a virtual exception for K through 1. Then, in the case of pre-K students, potential pre-K English learners who are not available for screening may be formally identified through the distance OKPKST. And I've been trying to think of a catchy way to pronounce that, and it's just not working for me. If anyone would like to suggest something, send me an email. The distance OKPK, or Oklahoma Pre-K screening test, is a modified version of the OKPKST that allows video conference or phone-based distance identification of potential pre-K English learners. A student assessed with the distance OKPKST should be reassessed with the traditional OKPKST upon returning to a traditional classroom setting. Okay, to move on then, once an English learner has been identified, then you are required to complete an English language academic plan for that student, or an ELAP. And this is a requirement under federal law. So the ELAP, together with a completed parental notification letter, fulfills district reporting requirements for identified English learners, outlined in Title I of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. Districts are required to provide the following information to parents of identified ELs. Okay, first, you have to provide the reasons for the identification of their child as an English learner, in need of placement in a language instruction educational program. Okay, this would be basically a test score on the screener test. You also are required to communicate the child's level of English proficiency, how that level was assessed, and the status of the child's academic achievement. You also need to communicate how the program will help their child learn English and meet age-appropriate academic achievement standards for grade promotion and graduation. This communication would also include specific exit requirements for the program, including expected rate of transition from such a program into mainstream classrooms and the expected rate of graduation from high school if funds under this part are used for children in high schools. So if you're using Title III funds in high schools, you also need to include this information. Okay, and that would include a 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rates and extended year adjusted cohort graduation rates for such program. In the case of a child with a disability, you'd also have to communicate how such a program meets the objectives of the Individualized Education Program, or the IEP, of the child as described in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So let's have a look at the ELAP itself. It's a 4-page document. There are several sections here. The first few are pretty straightforward. We have section 1, student information, just demographic information. And section 2 will show testing results, the OSTP test scores, or another norm reference test information if you're using that. And this would be the most current test scores. 3 then has a place for showing scores on the placement test, the screeners. And number 4 then shows the most recent WIDA access scores. So this is clearly for someone who is already in the program, because if you identify someone for the first time, they're not going to have access scores. But remember, the ELAP has to be updated on a yearly basis. So as kids work their way through the program, you'll have that information. And then the following section, kind of the longest section here, number 5, are your English language development goals. And we have, this is broken down by language domain: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And you have the levels and targets. These should align with the WIDA can-do targets for the student's grade level. And you can find these if you do an internet search of WIDA can do. They have a series of tables that are broken down by grade levels for expectations for children at different levels of English proficiency and grade levels to help you home in on what sort of targets, yearly targets, each student should have. And that's then broken down by domain. So it can change according to this, if the student's abilities are greater or lesser in each of these domains. Section 6 then provides a place where you can tell what kind of services you are providing the student. And this should align with your LIEP in your consolidated application. The Language Instruction Education Plan should contemplate any services that you mark here for an individual student, but this is where you show what it is that you're doing for the student to help the student reach the goals that you mentioned above in section 5. Then section 7, just below that, is telling you which assessments the student will be taking. So OSTP assessment and the which version of the English language proficiency assessment that student will take at the end of the year or over the course of the year. And then we have a page for accommodations, and this is broken down into 2 parts. There's a list of potential accommodations that can be given in a testing setting. That's number 8 there for the OSTP program. Or also section 9 accommodations that can be made for the student in the classroom. So this would be in mainstream classrooms, what flexibilities you can offer this particular student to support them as they learn both content and reach language proficiency. Okay, then the final page here is the signature page. This is pretty straightforward for the first part, that people who are drawing up the ELAP should sign it. That should be, certified personnel. The ELAP is really, it's parallel to an IEP in that sense, and you should have certified personnel who are drawing it up. So you have signature lines for the staff and for whoever's responsible for implementing it, and then for a supervisor. And then the final signature line at the bottom is a parental opt-out area. Parents do have the right to opt out. If they opt out, you have to have a signature on file. And I bring this up because there's been some discussion in the last couple of years about if all of the ELAPs require a parental signature or not. Only the ones in the case where a parent opts out of services are they required to sign it. But if you have a parent who wants to opt out of services, they have to sign this. It does not have to be in paper form. It is possible to have an electronic ELAP as long as it contains all of the same information. And clearly, if you have a parent that's opting out, they would need an electronic signature on that as well. Okay, one of the reasons I kind of belabor the point about the parent signature is when parents opt out, they're not opting out of EL status, and they can't entirely even opt out of EL services, because you have a civil rights obligation to educate all of your students, including English learners, and that civil rights obligation includes providing English language instruction to all of your students to get them up to speed. So what the parent is opting out of are supplemental EL services. So that would be supplemental tutoring, or perhaps working with an ESL para in the classroom. So it's tricky because you still have the obligation to educate that child and to bring their English up to a level of proficiency. And the only way for that child out of EL status is to test proficient and to move out of that status. But the parents can, for whatever reason, opt out of supplemental services. I'd throw in that I would discourage parents from doing that, but sometimes it does happen. Okay, so here, just to reiterate a few points here. The ELAP is really, it's parallel to an IEP and should be developed by certified staff. The ELAP outlines basic student demographic information, testing data, educational goals, as well as accommodations for testing and learning. The ELAP can follow a student in a specific year, but that's all. They're to be updated every year based on new testing data. And the last one, the ELAP is mandatory, and sample documentation is required for monitoring. So if your district is being monitored, we may ask for samples, especially in site visits. So you need to have these on hand, available. If they're electronic, you should be able to retrieve the information for individual students. Okay, more still, I'm going to repeat myself. You are allowed to use electronic resources to create an ELAP as long as all required information is recorded. And there are vendors out there who have some pretty slick products that will do this. It is mandatory that parents be notified of the completion of an ELAP, districts are expected to make a reasonable effort to ensure that parents understand their children's educational status. This means, in many cases, communicating in a language that parents understand. Parents also have the right to opt out of supplemental services, although this does not change the student's EL status, nor does it exempt the district from facilitating and encouraging student learning. So, okay, that's the end of our brief overview, and I'm going to open it up to questions. I see there are a couple of things in the chat box, and I'm also pleased to see that Dan Rule, who is the Executive Director of the Office of English Language Proficiency, has answered a couple of these, but let me just go through these. Okay, will the HLS ever be available in languages other than English, Spanish? I cannot say with certainty, but I certainly hope so. We had kind of an embryonic project to start translating a lot of the federally required documents. They got derailed by all of the upheaval of the last few months. I kind of hope we get that back on track sooner rather than later. So I'll say, yes, we hope to one day, but I'm certainly not going to commit to when that would be. Here's a question about the OSTP scores. May we use 2018-19? And Dan Rule has weighed in saying, bilingual qualification may look a little different this year if your district is serving ELs in a distance learning program. Additional guidance is available in the English Learner Return to Learn document and there's a web address. There's a link to this on the Office of English Language Proficiency's website. If you have not seen that website, I would suggest you give it a look. Go to the State Department of Education general website and search English Language Proficiency, and then it'll take you straight to their page where there's a lot of very useful information. Okay, for bilingual students, for bilingual less than students, can we use 2018-19 OSTP or RSA screener winter scores from 2019-20? Because of COVID-19, we were not able to give OSTP for the spring RSA screener. And again, here's an answer from Mr. Rule saying, it depends on the enrollment status of the student. Review the less often bilingual identification section in the document linked above. Okay, that would be in the return to learn, English learner return to your learn document. Okay, if I'm understanding this correctly, then on the ELAP, a student will have either a screener score or access scores. Yes, if it's a student that has just arrived in your district that you're identifying for the first time, they will have a screener score that qualifies them as EL. Then the following year, they will have an access score after they've been in your program and taken the access exam. That seems to be all the questions in the chat box at the moment. I'll give you a minute or so if you have any more questions. Otherwise, feel free to send your questions to me by email. Any questions about the home language survey, the ELAP, or Title III in general. Again, my name is Tom Kirk, and there's a phone number here. I'm in the office about half of the time now, so I may not answer that phone, but if you leave a voicemail, that does get forwarded to me. So The phone number is still good, although maybe not immediate. And email address is always good. And with that, I think I'm going to call it a webinar. Thank you very much.
Just go to more.